So now without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Mallory Newell, Vice President of Ipsos's Public Polling Team. Mallory, you have the floor.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ellen. It's my pleasure to be here with you today alongside my esteemed co-panelists. Here's some information on all of us, but I just want to take some time to introduce myself. As Ellen mentioned, I am part of Ipsos's public polling practice, one of the leads for the team that produces all of the public-facing research for Ipsos in the US, this research included. I'm joined by Jamie Stenziano. He's our Senior Client Officer for Media and Entertainment, plus Todd Hinckley and Russell Sargent from NBC Sports. Thank you both for taking the time to be here today. This research was really borne out by some questions that my team and I had about the wide world of sports. And that's a pretty big umbrella. We'll dive into fandom, kind of habits for viewership today, as well as sports betting. Obviously, there are myriad other issues that we can cover under the sports umbrella, but we think that these are most informative to really understand for particularly brands and companies, people's behavior when it comes to sports, what they're watching, what they're consuming, what they're playing, and why that matters. So before our panel discussion, I'm going to share some of the key findings from that research that we conducted earlier this year. And then we will have a discussion and talk about some of the implications. So for our data dive today, I really want to focus on two key areas: who sports fans are and how we consume sports, and then the landscape around sports betting, an emergent yet booming multi-billion-dollar industry. So I want to start by setting the stage a little bit in terms of who sports fans are. Oh, did I jump out? There we go. Okay, who sports fans are. So overall, what we know is that roughly 2/3 of Americans identify themselves as a fan of some sports. As you can see, both by the total on the left and then the age groups on sort of the middle and right side of your screen, the NFL really is dominant in terms of fandom here. But one interesting trait that is sort of borne out when you look by age is that younger people, so we're considering kind of those under 55, so that's really your Gen Xers, millennials, and Gen Z, have more diverse interests. So they're not completely coalescing around kind of America's pastime of baseball or the NFL, but you can see that there's sort of a grouped middle tier where these people report in pretty equal numbers that they're fans of baseball, of college football, college basketball, the NBA. Soccer is something that's growing in importance among younger Americans in particular. And so people are fans of different sports, but we'll see here later in the data that your age or your life stage has an impact for, what you're watching, what you're tuning into. And here I think that's really pronounced. One of the biggest emerging differences is how we are actually watching sports, how we are consuming sports. So here, this question is shown among those who reported watching an entire game or match for a sporting event, and showing kind of the big four here. So NFL football, NCAA football, Major League Baseball, and the NBA. But the trends are consistent throughout. So among those that are tuning into games, obviously live TV is still king, right? That is still the way that the vast majority of people are watching sports. And yet, with those under 35, we see an increasing reliance and importance on streaming platforms. And we know that in recent years, how we consume sports and where we watch sports has changed. And I look forward to Todd and Russell sharing some insights about that later on in today's discussion. Now, how do we become sports fans? For many, it's really your lived environment. Overall, 40% of Americans, roughly 2 in 5, say that I'm a fan of a sports team because I grew up with my family being fans of that team. I certainly fall into that category. A lifelong Michigander. I am actually a Chicago Bears fan, as sad as that is, because that's the team that my dad was a fan of. So that's what I grew up with. And you can see here that these patterns emerge in our data among sports fans, among those who bet on sports, and we'll get into who that is in a little bit, and those who are actually attending sports events in person. You can see there among those groups, those who are more engaged, those who are closer to sports, a majority, 3 in 5 in some cases, say that they're a fan because they were raised that way. So sports are kind of ingrained in our culture for those of us who consider ourselves to be fans in a way from birth. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on who is actually betting on sports. And as I mentioned at the top of this call, sports betting is a very lucrative industry, but one that is still emerging, right? Sports betting in apps, in person, is not legal in every state. And what we know is that it really is a very small number of Americans who are driving this burgeoning industry. We see here on the left, fewer than 1 in 10, just 8% of the population ages 18 and up say that they've bet on sports via an app or online in the past year. And fewer, only about 4%, say that they've bet on a sport in person. So going to a casino, going to a place where you can place a bet in person. And what we did in our analysis here is we obviously broke this out by states where sports betting is legal versus where it's not. And interestingly, among people in states where it is legal, the percentage of Americans that are betting via an app or online on sports is only slightly higher. So it is still a very small proportion of the population, regardless of where you are located, that is really driving this type of behavior so far. Now, let's dive into that a little bit. One of the things that I think we'll talk a lot about today is the way that sports betting can impact one's engagement with sports. And what we see here and what we see in our data is that really small proportion, that roughly 1 in 10 that bet on sports, are what I'd consider to be our core engaged fans. Right? So more than 8 in 10 of themselves report being sports fans, and 2/3 say that they attended a live sporting event in the past year. So they're actively watching, they're going in person. Over half participated in fantasy sports. So they're consuming sports in different ways, live, fantasy sports. And then finally, 2 in 5 actually watched esports in the past year. So another emerging industry, and you can start to see how all of these factors converge and are starting to mesh together. Now, I want to put that engagement in broader context here. So the yellow bars represent that proportion of the population that has bet on sports in the past year. The teal are sports fans themselves, and the blue is all Americans. So when you take, for example, 2/3 of sports bettors went to a live sporting event in person last year, is that a lot or a little? Compared to all Americans, and actually compared to sports fans, that's a lot. So only slightly over a quarter of all Americans attended a live sporting event in person last year. And then same thing, when it comes to participating in fantasy sports. The majority of people that bet on sports are engaging in this way, but very few Americans and sports fans alike are doing the same. Now, who is betting on sports? What is their profile? What do they look like? What we know from our Ipsos data is that those who are betting on sports tend to be more male than the population as a whole. 69% of sports bettors are men. And again, we're talking about a very small fraction of the population, but I just want to give some insight into who these people are. Most are white, That breakdown looks a little bit more similar to the US population as a whole than the gender, income, and age statistics. They do tend to be a little bit younger, under 35. And then finally, they do tend to have a little bit more disposable income. So the income proportion kind of skews a little bit more toward the higher income spectrum than the US population as a whole. So we know that, sports bettors are a very small percentage of the population, but how often are these people actually placing a bet on sports? Is it something that most are doing regularly, or is it kind of a one-off thing? And what our data found is that most are doing this pretty infrequently. You can see that roughly 1 in 3, if you look all the way to the left, say that they've bet on sports just once in the past year. We don't know what that one time was, but we could speculate maybe it's for a big event, right? They placed money, they placed a bet for the Super Bowl or for March Madness, for example. And when you take that together with those saying that they do it just a few times a year, again, just rare occasions, maybe a big event, that's when over half of sports fans or sports bettors are doing their betting. So again, very infrequent, not necessarily a regular thing. And you can see that 20% say that they're doing it several times a month or more. So the minority of a minority are betting regularly on sports. For most, it's just kind of a 1 or 2 times throughout the year big thing. Now, this is one of the main questions that we went into our research with. My colleagues and I wanted to understand not only who was betting on sports and how frequently, but what's the tie to sports fandom? Why does it matter if people are betting on sports? And our hypothesis was that people that are actually putting money down are more likely to be engaged in sort of the sports world writ large. And the data shows this to be clearly true. When you ask Americans overall, do you agree or disagree, sports betting is a way to get people more engaged in sports? Overall, the public's kind of split. They lean toward disagreeing. Sports fans themselves, in fact, are still split on whether betting increases engagement. But those who are actually doing it, 7 in 10, say that, yeah, it's a way to get people more engaged. And their own behavior that they've shown in this poll shows that to be true. Now, we also wanted to try and understand why people aren't betting on sports. Is it a moral issue? Is it a financial issue? And we kind of broke this out into 3 main categories, right? Is it a money issue? And for many people who are sports fans but are not betting on sports, just feel like it's not for them financially. It's a waste of money, or they don't have the money. However, there's about roughly half, maybe a little bit less than half, that don't really know where to start. They either don't know enough about sports to wager, or they don't know about gambling itself or the process that it entails. So there is sort of this knowledge gap, which, given how rapidly this industry has started to take shape, is not surprising. And then those that actually have a moral opposition to it, that's roughly about 40% in terms of the reason. For this one, you could select multiple answers, which is why this doesn't add up to 100%. Now, I think that's important to note that even though some of these sports fans who do not bet say that they don't really want to spend their money like that, they still remain in favor of sports betting and still hold the belief that people should be able to spend their money how they want to. So when you ask people, we gave them 2 choices, and which side do you agree with more? Obviously, this is not a black or white issue, but it's a good way to measure generally where people lean on the issue. People should be able to gamble on sports and spend their money how they want, or it's wrong because it promotes activities that can lead to addiction, that sort of moral argument that some people talk about. Among sports fans, it is clear, 2-1, they feel that people should be able to gamble on sports and spend their money how they want. And a very slim majority of those who do not consider themselves sports fans, which is, again, roughly about a third of the population, still favor that side that they should be able to spend their money and make these choices how they want. So all of this is to kind of give you a general sense of how people are consuming sports, some of the emergent trends, which we'll dive into in just a moment, particularly when it comes to streaming, but then also the impact that sports gambling and betting can have on this industry, because similar to streaming platforms, relatively new, but all signs point to them not really going anywhere and to kind of keep expanding. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Jamie, who's going to kick off our panel discussion, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Super informative data. I really appreciate that. Let's transition to our panel roundtable segment of the discussion today, and I'd like to welcome in Russell and Todd from NBC Sports. Really appreciate your time, guys, today. And as we progress through this segment, folks watching or listening live, please do drop a question into the chat if you have one, and we will definitely get to it towards the end if time allows, or we'll follow up with you afterwards if we happen to run out of time today. Excellent. So let's start off, and I think building off of several of the points that Mallory mentioned, we obviously all know that how viewers and listeners consume sports has changed. And for the group, Russell, Todd, Mallory, where do you see sports betting factoring in terms of consumption patterns and the evolution of sports consumption as we see it?
I think, thanks, Jamie. I'll jump in from our perspective to start on that one. I think there's a few different things that we think about in terms of the evolution. One, it's about attracting new audiences. I think while we did see that there was a pretty significant overlap between bettors and sports fans, I think we know that there's not universal overlap. So there are some people who are going to join into the sports fan ecosystem because of the opportunity to bet. That gives us opportunities in terms of how we program, in terms of what kinds of things you'll put in front of sports fans and within our content, so that you're seeing that change over time, whether it's betting integrations themselves or additional forms of content. So it gives a little bit of additional flexibility in the kind of content that we put out there. And part of that is because that we think that this has the chance to drive engagement and consumption on multiple levels. You're getting people to watch more, and you're getting people to watch more content. And that comes from either sports fans who are already watching a lot of games, who are going to watch more games. You get that from sports fans who haven't tuned in before and are going to try something new. But they're also one of the pieces, Mallory, that you talked about was education. When we've talked to our viewers and our consumers, you're getting people who say, in order to bet, I want to learn more. In order to learn more, I'm going to watch more. And it's not just about the live games, it's about a lot of the ancillary content. So it's our studio shows, it's our analysis shows. People want to be educated, either spoken to in a direct betting manner, or just find new ways to consume sports, whether it's reading or watching new stuff. So I think we see it starting to affect consumption in all of those areas.
Absolutely, appreciate that, Todd. And anyone else want to build?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, from our perspective, we expect to see people engaging more sports and in a variety of ways, right? It's not just watching the live event. It's multiple events at once across multiple platforms, because as that interest spreads from a betting perspective where you have a vested interest in multiple sports, it's not just watching one game of my favorite team, it's watching multiple games that could be going on at the same time. And then it goes beyond that game window as well. It's that sort of that search for information, that search for the bettor's competitive advantage, where they're going to want to engage with the sport throughout the week before they've placed that bet, so that they can understand what's possible. And then the only other point I'll make on that is that I also think the evolution of legal sports gambling, really provides an advantage to evolving sports properties. So Mallory referenced soccer, for example. If you take a look at soccer and you look at how the consumption of soccer in the United States has grown over the past 30 years or so, and whether that's the domestic MLS or whether it's consumption of global sports or global soccer properties like the English Premier League, that consumption has evolved. If you think about that, if soccer was just getting started now, so to speak, or that growth in soccer was just starting now, think about how much legal sports gambling can supercharge that growth trajectory and really shorten the window from going from, if you want to say niche to mainstream, that you can shorten that window because of the engagement from sports betting.
Yeah,
I also
absolutely.
think that there's some signs in our data that we're not really sure where the ceiling is yet, both in betting, but also fandom writ large, right? So when we ask people about their consumption habits, we know that one of the ways that we asked it is, if you've watched a game, a full game or match, or if you've watched a certain sporting event in the past year, how did you watch it? And we showed live TV and streaming, but there's also an option to say that I watched clips afterwards, or I watched kind of some of the recap, right? We know that people are taking in sports through those avenues. So they may be tuning in when it happens, but then they may be revisiting something after the fact, or watching, to look ahead to the game next week or in a couple days. And then also, we've placed a lot of emphasis on sports fans themselves, and we know that the majority of American adults consider themselves to be fans, but our data shows that even those non-fans report tuning into some of the major sporting events through the past year. So I do think that there is an opportunity, even for those kind of casual viewers, those who tune in, to start to, per what Todd was saying, kind of find that education and maybe evolve their fandom from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. I love the point about the ancillary surrounding content that you can sort of program for fans to consume as they think about the actual event. And then also this idea that those types of touch points can also help to move fans along the spectrum from more casual to more avid over time. I think that's a really, really good point. Let's talk about betting itself, and sports betting, of course, is a huge industry. And Mallory, you teed this up a few minutes ago. Obviously, our data shows that it's driven, at least today, by a relatively small proportion of the population. And so I guess the question can be posed, what are some other ways that sports fans can engage with the teams they support, or just simply deepen their connection to sports as a whole? I think this builds also on top of what you were commenting on, Todd, initially. So if folks want to tackle that one.
Yeah, I think it starts with a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about today, including a lot of the data that Mallory showed. But one of the things that I'll say first is that small part of the population that is actively betting, Mallory, you touched on it, it's a little bit influenced by legalization and where you live. I know you kind of got into that division there, but we've certainly seen that in some of the data that we talk about. Regardless of where you live, there seems to be a broad support of legalization in a sense that there is a natural fit between betting and the telecasts that you're watching and the sports that you're consuming. We talked a little bit about that medium, so you might already be a bettor. There's a small opposition to it. There's a lot of people in the middle that are okay with this being a part of their way that they consume, the way that they engage sports. It's a part of the ecosystem moving forward. Whether or not they shift to becoming a bettor, that's a lot of what we just talked about in the answer to the first question. So I think we're seeing a lot of that in terms of the support for sports betting and its inclusion in sports may go beyond the group of people that are already actively betting. So that's part of why the industry has a chance to benefit from it, from broadcasters' perspectives, from operators' perspectives, from other brands' perspectives who are going to get involved with sports, because that has a chance to really influence the overall pie. And that brings us back to, I think, our first answer to your question, Jamie, is, in the ways that people engage. It was one of, I think, on your slides, Mallory. It starts with watching sports. That is still the first thing that people think of in terms of what are they going to do, how are they going to consume sports, what is the biggest thing they do that typifies their fandom. It's watching live. It's watching live premium content where you can find it in a lot of places. That's on our airwaves, and that's still the kind of the best place and sort of the first place that you might go to consume and engage with sports. And then a lot of things build from there, whether it's the ancillary content that we talked about, fantasy sports, following on social media, going to live events. Those things sort of follow suit afterwards. But we know that the TV and streaming product is still top of mind.
Yep, and I just brought it back up on the screen to show again that reminder of how sports fans are already engaging with the world around them. But then if you go back and look, here's where we're at on TV versus streaming.
Absolutely. Good points. Mallory, did you want to keep going?
Yeah, I wanted to build on something that Todd said. So obviously when we were analyzing the data, it's very clear, who is betting on sports. They tell us. We asked, have you done this in the past year? Yes or no. But I think there's a lot of ways to sort of look into an audience that I would tag as persuadables, right? And it's who are the people that consider themselves to be a fan, might be doing something active like going to a live sporting event or getting involved in fantasy sports, and who are also favorable or feel like, in that last slide that I showed, do you think people should be able to bet and spend their money how they want or not? And the people that come down in the camp of the former. And, in that group, we're kind of seeing that the persuadables, again, to use that term, still more likely to be men than women, but they skew a little bit older than bettors. So maybe it's the folks that have, kind of going back to one of the first points, sort of grown up with sports, grown up with sports fandom, had a team or teams that they've followed for many years. And maybe it's just a question of that increased knowledge or awareness, right? Is betting legal in my state? For these older people, how do I work an app to do this? So I think there is another cohort, which when you cut it that way is, kind of, again, another 1 in 10 of the population. So you start to see where we can get this small but perhaps steady growth in increased engagement and increased awareness of sports betting and how that sort of ties into the broader fan experience.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, Russell, yeah.
Sorry, Jamie. I think Todd and Mallory have covered most of this, but I would just say it's never been a better time to be a sports fan, whether you're a sports bettor or not. I mean, as we've seen with media more broadly, sports fans now have more ways, more platforms, more touch points to engage in their fandom than ever before, right? It's because of technology, it's become easier to stay connected. It's easier for either sports properties themselves or media companies who are engaging with sports fans to progress fans through that funnel and have them become more fanatic and more avid because of the many different touch points that we have available. And I absolutely, it would be interesting to have a conversation with some of the folks who don't identify as sports bettors, but do they engage in fantasy sports? Do they engage in some of these free-to-play style games that are out there? And maybe whether it's morally or whether it's financially, don't see that as sports betting, but it still fuels much of the same engagement because of that additional interest. There's not just the interest in, is my team going to win, but you have an interest in other athletes and the performance of other teams based on those other engagement points.
I think that's exactly right, Russ. That was the added group. Mallory, I think intentionally you had a pretty strict definition of what betting was for bettors in this instance. It was people that had actually been to a casino or done an in-person, gambling event or using apps. We have that definition as well. But Russ just touched on all the different ways that have been more open and more available to sports fans for years, whether it's fantasy sports, whether it's friendly pools, whether it's box games or things like that. That there are other ways that fans have gotten to some form of this engagement over time. And I think that also starts to broaden the part of the sports fan population that are driving this activity and are reaping the benefits from it. So I think that's part of where the pie gets a little bit bigger.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the points that Mallory touched on earlier was with respect to age cohorts and generational cohorts. And so we talked about the fact that, for example, younger folks are report being fans of more sports. So let's think into the future a little bit. What does that say about the trajectory at large here, and what both media companies and other types of brands have to do moving forward to engage those younger fans? If we can talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one, Jamie. I think, as it becomes a more crowded landscape, I think first and foremost, I think brands need to have a really good understanding of their objectives of engaging through sports. I think the days of being able to be all things to all people, those don't really exist anymore. So having that understanding of who you want to reach, who those fans are, and then ultimately what's the desired outcome with those fans are all critical to starting that engagement in an effective way. And then the next step from there is, using creativity to differentiate your brand. I think we've all become used to seeing a lot of brand engagement through sports. So how do you differentiate? How do you stand out from the crowd? Keeping those objectives in mind, how does a brand deliver a creative engagement to a fan that actually enhances the experience for the fan, whether that fan's in the venue or watching via a media plan? And then, with that engagement, it needs to go, like we talked about at the start of this conversation, going beyond those competition moments. It's not just about engaging with the fan between the 90 minutes of a soccer game or the 60 minutes of the game clock in an NFL game or whatever the sport might be, but how do you enhance the buildup, the anticipation, and enhance that experience that I said a moment ago, not just again in the competition moments, but in the lead up to the event, in the analysis post event, so that you really become, sort of embedded and entrenched in that sports fan's experience throughout the experience for the full week, not just on game day.
I think sorry, Jamie, one of the other things that we looked at was in terms of the number of sports that people bet on. I think that was another one where it follows a little bit of your trend, but those people who have already, broken the seal and gone down this road in their fan journey, they are maybe more willing to bet on more sports than they even follow on a regular basis. Some of that comes from the sort of the new opportunity that it provides. Some of it probably comes to the exploration of new sports, like, sort of what could happen to soccer and the way that Russ described it before. You're finding people, it may follow a similar age pattern where the younger generation may be more the really, really frequent bettors, maybe following 6 or 7 sports or betting on 6 or 7 sports. I think we've seen the behavior follow there, but I think what we've seen in terms of the age split, I think what we've seen is that you may actually be more likely to bet on more sports than what you're following on a regular basis. And then I think that's part of the upside and the opportunity for what this engagement does to the the viewing experience, the viewing environment, and how many more people you have that are attentive, that are really, really interested in the content, and it provides a really good environment for broadcasters and brands as well.
Yeah, obviously, I'm a researcher. I'm not a brand here, but I don't think it's a coincidence that in our data we see that younger Americans are more likely to engage in sports betting, more likely to engage in fantasy sports, and they're also the ones that have this more diverse set of interests, right? They're also, kind of the predominantly online generation, right? So now you're tuning into your teams, your favorite athletes on social media. You're watching clips, you're watching highlights, you're watching things on TikTok throughout the week. You're consuming Ted Lasso, right? Like sports, whether we realize it or not, whether we consider ourselves fans or not, sports are all around us and in a lot of different ways to be consumed. And I think that's what younger Americans are starting to pick up on. Right? And betting is just one way that they can express their diverse interests in sports.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about live sports and live TV. And Todd, you made this point earlier in terms of that premium content. So when we think about that younger audience who may be more inclined to split their attention between, say, a live TV on linear, or maybe streaming, maybe highlight culture, as we talked about, from a business perspective, how are you adapting to that change in attention and where that viewer attention lies?
I can jump in here, Jamie. I think for us, this is sort of a massive strategic imperative for our company that we've really invested in. And we've taken a direct approach to that very challenge, or to that very evolution, through our streaming service, Peacock. So in conjunction with NBC Sports, Peacock has become our new sports channel, where streamers can watch everything from the biggest events in the world, like the Super Bowl, the FIFA World Cup this past fall, the Paris 2024 Olympics coming next summer, WrestleMania, which was a couple weekends ago, or major weekly sporting events like Sunday Night Football, our NFL coverage, the Premier League, and soon, the Big Ten football. So we've created this sports channel where all of these major events are available. We also make more niche events like super motocross or rugby available via Peacock. And so what we're doing here is serving all audiences, right? Where the biggest events are both on NBC and on Peacock. So a more traditional viewer can still consume those huge events via broadcast television, as they've been doing all their lives. But the younger streamer can still have access to them as well through Peacock. Either way, the audience is being accommodated, right? It's ultimately gets down to serving that premium content to the viewer in the destination and the platform that they're most comfortable using. But I think importantly for us as well, when we look at that challenge, in doing so and in serving that viewer wherever they choose to consume the content, not only do we serve that audience, which is our most important goal, but we also then provide access to this audience to our brand partners. We have advertising and sponsorship opportunities through these events on Peacock, because the brand community is also dealing with this challenge, right? How do we get our sponsorship messaging, our messaging through to the sports fan as they choose to consume on different platforms? And through Peacock, we serve our brand partners as well as the viewers.
I think one of the ways that I view the strategy that Russ just kind of described is that what the streaming services afford companies like ours is it's kind of like when the newspaper industry was disrupted. It was no longer constrained by columns, right? You had online platforms where you could write at greater length to provide kind of some different nuance. That's kind of what the streaming platforms have provided with all these additional opportunities and sometimes different streams within a single opportunity that enhance that experience, whether it's betcast type streams, whether it's watching single players in your golf telecast, or the featured groups coverage that we've adopted in for a lot of tournaments. It's kind of provided that additional flexibility and opportunity to present the sports in new ways as well. As part of what has changed the fan dynamic a little bit for some traditional sports that have been historically part of the national ecosystem, whether it's golf or baseball. You're finding them having to adapt and sit on our platforms in new ways as well, and that's been kind of cool to see how leagues are working with us to try to meet this new demand.
Excellent. Let's turn back to betting for a second, because I think one of the questions that folks might have in mind as we go through the data and have this conversation is around the future trajectory. How large of a slice of the pie does this betting cohort occupy? Maybe not today, but in the future. And I think, Todd, you mentioned this earlier, the notion of legislation and other variables that that might lead to or unlock more potential for the space to broaden. Are there any thoughts moving forward as to what levers there might be for an increased cohort of that sports betting population, or what trajectories you see moving forward in this space specifically?
To increase the number of people who would actually start to bet, or what are some of the decisions that they're making?
Exactly, starting to bet.
I think that it starts with access and legalization. That's within the work that we've done. That is usually kind of the tip of the spear. And I think what we've found is that I think I said this earlier, that the number of people who are distinctly opposed to betting, period, and opposed to its integration within their sports is actually pretty small, and in some cases, maybe some even smaller and different data sets than what, Mallory, you're showing here, or in one of the other slides in terms of what that opposition is. So what I think beyond that, then, Jamie, one of the ways to draw out this activity comes back to education. That was one of the big findings that we had in some of the work that we've done. And it increases the opportunity that we can break up the telecast or communicate during a program. It is sort of informing again what this option really is. What are the ways to bet? What are certain words? What do certain phrases mean? I think this slide harps on the fact of how much of the sports fan population may not know the difference between a money line and an odds, for a certain game. So going back to education could be one of the things that starts to make this behavior increase even more than it already has.
Yeah, and I think that's where some of the those I referenced it earlier, free-to-play games, fantasy, they serve as an engagement tool, but to Todd's point, I think they serve as an education tool as well, which eventually builds a comfort level with perhaps transitioning a sports fan from a non-bettor to a bettor.
Yeah, I would personally be curious, and we haven't dug into this in our data, but what's the number of sports fans that say that they have done things like, engaged in fantasy sports, watched esports, things like that, some of those other engagement tools that we've covered. But their reasons for not betting are just that they don't know enough, right? I think it's likely to be a significant number. So if you look at that, then I think it not only becomes a question of, how many potential sports fans are sort of on the table here, but also, what does it look like? Do we start to get older people involved? Do we start to get more women involved, right? So it's not just all young men focused on sports, but people are sort of coming into their engagement in different ways.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely a topic for exploration in the future, when we all as researchers think about the topics to cover around sports betting moving forward. Excellent. Just a quick time check. I believe we have about 1 minute or so left, and I am going to check the Q&A. Okay, we have one question, if we can cover this quickly for the panel. The question is, with sports betting becoming more accepted, do you envision leagues like NBA and NFL adopting practices like XFL and PLL, where betting lines are discussed on broadcast?
I think you've already seen a tremendous amount of evolution in a very short time. If you look at the NFL, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, any discussion of sports betting related to NFL content was not allowed, and now we have a lot more leeway to engage in that discussion around the NFL and a number of other property partners. I think there always has to be an appropriate responsibility when you consider the athletes involved, especially when you start to talk about collegiate sports. But absolutely, I mean, our Premier League coverage on NBC Sports, if you look at that, where globally sports betting for a very long time has been a big part of that culture. Until it became legal here, obviously we weren't going to touch that. But now, if you look at our pregame coverage, we'll regularly talk about not just match odds, but we'll talk about odds of first goal scorer or anytime goal scorer. So it's evolved very quickly in a very short amount of time to become a part and an accepted part of sort of pregame and in-game coverage.
Yeah, I think that's the other piece that we saw from the research side from the fans is that they're hungry for it. And again, the lack of opposition to the activity extends to a lack of opposition to that kind of integration within the telecasts. It kind of just enhances the environment, and as you said, raises the attention level, which has benefits towards the brands who are involved in the sport as well, and creates a more rapt audience. So I think we've seen it in that form too.
And again, this is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but just from an active observer, when you go to stadiums now and you're seeing advertisements for betting, depending on what state you're in, of course, but you're seeing commercials, Kevin Hart betting commercials for this during the Super Bowl. It does start to feel like it is trickling into our collective consciousness in a way that it wasn't even a few years ago. Right? So it feels like we are, obviously people have been consuming sports for many, many years, but we are on the cusp of just this massive change, not just with betting, but with engagement writ large. And I think it's a really exciting time to be a sports fan and to, have an interest in whether it's a specific team or a specific sport or even a professional athlete or a college athlete that you like to follow. We've gone a couple of minutes over. I just want to say a huge thank you to my co-panelists, to Russell and Todd, for taking time to join us today. I know that there were some questions in the chat that we weren't able to get to, but we will be sending a recap with this recording out afterwards. And I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar and for tuning in to learn more about this Ipsos research. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us,
everyone.
Thank you.